And then once we run out of the historical data, then I would argue that we can actually do modern-day miracle accounts, for instance, to update even today.
But there's no updating because all of those accounts are from the same sources.
Modern-day miracle accounts?
Modern-day miracle accounts have no bearing on whether or not Jesus is resurrected.
This is part 2 of my critique of Than Christopoulos' Bayesian apologetics. Before I continue where I left off, I want to introduce something called the Linda problem. The Linda problem is a famous example in psychology and probability theory. It was developed to show how easily human intuition can go wrong when we judge probability. The setup goes like this. Linda is described as a 31-year-old woman who is single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and she also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Then people are asked which statement is more probable. 1. Linda is a bank teller. 2. Linda is a bank teller and active in a feminist movement. Most people choose the second one, and intuitively that makes sense. The second option sounds more like Linda. It fits the story better. If you hear that description, bank teller and feminist, feels more natural than just bank teller. But mathematically, the second option cannot be more probable. Why? Because the second option includes 2 claims. Linda has to be a bank teller, and she also has to be active in the feminist movement. That makes it a narrower claim. A narrower claim cannot be more likely than the broader claim that contains it. Every Linda who is both a bank teller and a feminist is already included in a group of bank tellers. But not every bank teller has to be a feminist. So the probability of bank teller and feminist cannot be higher than the probability of bank teller. This mistake is called the conjunction fallacy. And I think this is exactly the kind of mistake Than makes when he tries to calculate the prior probability of Jesus' resurrection. When the hypothesis is simply Jesus was resurrected, Than understands why the prior should be low. Dead people do not normally rise from the dead. It will be hard for him to push back against skeptics who say that since nobody has ever been confirmed to be resurrected in human history, the prior probability of someone rising from the dead should be extremely low. So Than does not really start with the simple claim, Jesus was resurrected. Instead, he places the resurrection inside a much bigger story. Not just a theistic story, but a specifically Christian story. In his blog, he introduces this by saying he is going to use more accurate priors. What does that mean? First, he says, let's assume we are agnostic between atheism and theism, and assign theism a 50% likelihood. So that is what more accurate means here. Start by giving theism 50%. That is not a measured probability. That is not a number discovered from evidence. That is an assumption. Then he says that while he personally thinks theism entails an incarnation, he will assign a low value for dramatic effect. Again, this is not based on a clear reference class. It's not like we have a history of gods existing and then we can count how often they become incarnate. He is assigning a number to a theological judgment. Then he asks, if God becomes incarnate, what is the probability that God would validate that incarnation through resurrection? And pay attention to how he frames it. He appeals to background knowledge involving defeating death and inaugurating redemption. But that is already a Christian-shaped story. Once you have already assumed God, incarnation, divine purpose, redemption, and the defeat of death, of course resurrection starts to feel likely. It fits the story. It sounds like the expected climax. And that is why Than feels justified in assigning that step a probability of 90%. So when we put his numbers together, we get 50% for theism, 10% for incarnation, and 90% for resurrection as divine validation. That gives us 4.5%. And according to Than, this gives us a more accurate prior probability for Jesus' resurrection. But this is where the Linda problem should make us stop. The simple claim is Jesus was resurrected. Than's more detailed version is basically Jesus was resurrected as God incarnate in order to defeat death and inaugurate redemption as part of God's divine plan. That second version may feel more natural to a Christian. It may feel more meaningful. It may fit the Christian story better. But it is not a simpler claim. It is a more complicated claim. And those additional components also need justification. The Christian story does not actually solve the low prior problem. It simply surrounds the resurrection with other Christian assumptions. And once those assumptions are in place, the resurrection starts to feel less surprising. That is why I think Than is committing the same kind of mistake as the conjunction fallacy. Bank teller and feminist feels more probable than bank teller because it fits the story about Linda. God incarnate rising from the dead to defeat death feels more probable than a dead person rising from the dead because it fits the Christian story. That feeling, however, is not probability. Let me show you why including those Christian assumptions should actually lower the prior probability of Jesus' resurrection, not raise it. Let's look at that 4.5% first. What does it mean? It is basically like saying there's a 4.5% chance that God would become incarnate and validate that incarnation through resurrection somewhere in human history. But that is not the same as the probability of Jesus rising from the dead. It is the probability of observing something like that in all of human history. To get a probability of us successfully pinpointing that lucky person, you need to divide that number by the total population throughout history. And here is the catch. It needs to be much more than the total number of people who have ever lived, which is about 100 billion. Because we also need to take into consideration that this God incarnate might appear 1,000 years from now. So we can safely use 200 billion as a rough estimate. The resulting prior probability is therefore extremely low, less likely than 1 in 4 trillion. Than tries to sidestep this by assuming that if God becomes incarnate and makes a show of resurrection, that must be Jesus. But probability does not give you that for free. If you don't get the math, let me explain it another way. Suppose we have a bag of balls, and I say there is a 4.5% chance that I attach the sticker to one of the balls in the bag. Does that mean there's a 4.5% chance that the first ball I draw from the bag will have the sticker on it? No, of course not. So how do we calculate the probability that the first ball I draw will be the one with the sticker? We divide 4.5% by the number of balls in the bag. If there are 100 balls, then 4.5% divided by 100 is 0.045%. I hope this is clear now. I feel like this should not need that much explanation because this concept is literally taught in Statistics 101. I still remember learning this in college 25 years ago, but I'm surprised that Than missed it. So I want to make sure I bring this point across clearly. The probability of something happening once somewhere in human history is not the same as the probability of that thing happening to one particular individual. And just briefly, I have tons of arguments lined up to make that 4.5% even lower. For example, no God and God should not be treated as a simple 50-50 split. Because there are many concepts of God, not just the one Than believes in. If we put theism into the probability space, then everything being equal, theism gets only 33% of the probability. I can keep adding options like pantheism, polytheism, and so on. But you get the idea. Also, Than says God would choose to become incarnate and validate that incarnation through resurrection. But the fact that people are still arguing today about whether God exists or whether Jesus rose from the dead is exactly why I would not expect God, if he exists, to choose this method. Why would God limit himself to one historical setting, reveal himself to a limited number of people, and then expect that to function as his revelation to the whole world? That is just insane. People have very good justification for not believing this. And if God truly became incarnate and rose from the dead, why appear mostly to his disciples and then ascend only after a few weeks? That does not sound like what a loving God who wants a relationship with everyone who ever existed would do. It sounds more like what a religious group would say later to justify why the appearances were so limited. There are other reasons why I think the prior probability of Jesus' resurrection should still be assigned far lower than 1 in 4 trillion, but let's move on for now. There's another important point I want to make on this issue. When Thand tries to incorporate his theology into the calculation of prior probability, if he's doing it correctly, he's actually hurting his case even more. Why? Because if he did not incorporate his theology, he could have said something like this. Maybe there were 100 resurrection cases in human history, so the prior probability should not be 1 in 100 billion. It should be closer to 1 in 1 billion. He could have made that argument, but that is not how he framed his prior probability. He did not frame it as merely the probability of a particular person rising from the dead. He framed it as the probability of a particular person rising from the dead and being God incarnate, which was supposed to have only happened once in human history. Adding that concept of incarnation into the prior probability might seem intuitively to boost it. In reality, it does the opposite. Now, Thand has a much harder time rejecting the use of 1 in 100 billion or even 1 in 200 billion, because we cannot simply assume that the incarnation has already happened. If the hypothesis is connected to God becoming incarnate somewhere in human history, then we also have to consider the possibility that it has not happened yet. And as a side note, I don't know why Thand thinks being raised from the dead is the best way to validate that someone is God incarnate. Resurrection stories are not uncommon. In China and many parts of the Eastern world, a person rising from the dead is not unheard of. It does not necessarily signify divinity. In many cases, it can even be seen as a bad omen. So if God really wanted to impress humanity, he would need to do more than play human and raise himself from the dead. Just saying. It is also worth pointing out that even if we grant that we can update the probability of a person rising from the dead using material evidence and testimony, there is really no conceivable way to update that 4.5% in a way Thand needs. It is not like we can just ask God whether he desires to become incarnate. Before we can update that 10% probability of God's desire to become incarnate, we first need to establish that God exists. But we have no reliable way to confirm God's existence in any direct way. We can use the ontological argument, the teleological argument, the moral argument, and so on. But at the end of the day, those arguments just turn God into a placeholder. The universe needs an uncaused cause or an unmoved mover. So let's call this entity God. There seems to be objective morality. Where does it come from? Let's define the source of that objective morality as God. But these are all inferences, not hard data. And if we plug those arguments into Bayesian analysis, we run into the same problem again. We have no hard data to plug in real positive rates and false positive rates. We are still left with guesses. And it's not like confirming Jesus was resurrected would automatically get us there either. To say that Jesus was resurrected is one thing. To say that he is God incarnate is a whole other thing. Christians often think that if they can show Jesus was resurrected, then the whole Christian theology package is also confirmed. No, that's not how it works. Bayesian analysis does not give you that for free. In other words, no matter how much evidence we find for Jesus' resurrection, that evidence can only update the probability that Jesus was resurrected. It does not automatically update the probability that Jesus was resurrected in order to validate his identity as God incarnate. We need other types of evidence for that. That is why it is unwise to mix all of these claims into one Bayesian analysis. The better move is not to assume all of those background theological claims, but to state the hypothesis more simply. Jesus was raised from the dead. Period. Then we can work from there. But even if we assume there is no gap there, even if we assume that proving Jesus was resurrected would also prove that Jesus is God incarnate, we are still very far from proving that Jesus was raised from the dead. So how does Thand address this problem? To be fair, he is right when he says that even if we start with a crazy low prior, we can still update it by using miracle accounts and raise the probability until that low prior is overcome. But as we saw in a previous video, it is not that simple. The main insurmountable problem is that we have no hard data to establish the true positive rates in the first place. Because we have absolutely no precedent of confirmed miracles, let alone confirmed resurrections, we are still guessing. And even if we ignore that problem, a few ancient documents claiming that there were reports of a person being resurrected still would not really cut it. Fan knows this, so he comes up with a creative method to boost the posterior probability. He does not stop with the New Testament. He also claims that modern-day miracles, where Jesus supposedly appears and performs miraculous healings, should also count as evidence for Jesus' physical resurrection from the dead. He talks about this in his blog, but I think it might be clearer if I show you this clip where he explains how it works when he debated Matt Dillahunty. This is what he said.
And then once we run out of the historical data, then I would argue that we can actually do modern-day miracle accounts, for instance, to update even today.
But there's no updating because all of those accounts are from the same sources.
Modern-day miracle accounts?
Modern-day miracle accounts have no bearing on whether or not Jesus is resurrected.
Well, I would push back on that because, for instance, if you have a miracle account with an associated Christophany, and that Christophany predicts, hey, go reach out to this person, and you're going to be prayed for, and you'll be healed of cerebral palsy, which you've had for 30 plus years. You're paraplegic. You have the brain scans to prove it. All this other stuff. It's biologically impossible to be healed. You get prayed for by that type of that same person. This is the story of Marlene Klepees, and we can dig into this if you want. Long story short is the religious context of this, because she was healed instantaneously, walked, she scored, I think, 40 points higher in her muscular exams, all this other stuff. She was reviewed by a medical board that, for instance, took care of her for the last, I think it was 20 years. I don't remember everything off the top of my head, but we can look at the notes if you want. And the long story short is Christophany, religious context, prayed in Jesus' name, and she was healed instantaneously, walking, and today she's still healthy as a normal person, no brain defects, nothing. And it seems to me like if we conditionalize and say, if this is a genuine miracle claim done in Jesus' name, if Jesus is alive today, you would expect to see something like that, where if Jesus was dead today, something like that is drastically unexpected.
This is bad on so many levels, and it really exposes Than's standard of evidence and his desperation to make this work. The rest of this video will focus on why bringing in modern-day miracles does not work in his favor, because I have a lot to say about this. First, do modern people have any way to confirm that the person appearing to them is actually Jesus and not some other being with the power to appear to people, or just a hallucination, a dream, or imagination? How do they recognize him as Jesus anyway? Did this Jesus eat fish? Did anyone touch his wounds? Did multiple people see him together? Was there anything remotely comparable to the kind of physical, multisensory appearance Than wants to emphasize when he defends the New Testament resurrection account? This is important because in his blog, Than emphasizes that the New Testament testimony accounts are multimodal and multisensory. But the first example of a modern miracle involving a Christophany that he cites to support the resurrection of Jesus is a woman who reports having a dream about Jesus before she receives the supposed healing. Apparently, when the story is useful to his case, the lack of multimodal, multisensory evidence suddenly does not bother him. The bar can be lowered as he sees fit. That is a problem of inconsistency. Than wants the New Testament appearances to be strong evidence because they are allegedly physical, public, and sensory, but then he wants a modern dream about Jesus to count as evidence that Jesus is alive today and therefore that Jesus physically rose from the dead in the first century. If a dream about Jesus can raise the probability of Jesus' resurrection, then dreams, visions, and religious experiences from every other religion also need to be allowed into the same Bayesian machinery. And once we do that, Christianity does not get a special advantage. It becomes just one more religion appealing to personal experiences, visions, and miracle claims. For example, Catholics have reported Marian apparitions and miraculous healings for generations. Lourdes alone has recorded more than 7,000 healing claims, and 72 cures have been recognized as miraculous by the Catholic Church. So does Than also accept these reports? Should Protestants all convert to Catholicism because of those Marian apparitions? Or take Falun Gong. Many practitioners claim healing or dramatic health improvement after practicing Falun Gong. One survey of Taiwanese Falun Gong practitioners reported that among those with chronic diseases, 70% to 89% said their conditions improved or were cured. So should those testimonies raise the probability that Falun Gong's spiritual teachings are true? This is the problem. If Than lowers the bar and allows modern Christian miracle claims to update the probability of Jesus' resurrection, he cannot just arbitrarily exclude miracle claims from Catholics, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Falun Gong practitioners, or any other religious group. That would be special pleading. And that is especially a problem for Christianity, because Christianity claims there is only one true God. If Christianity were polytheistic, it could simply say there are many gods performing different miracles, and each god has its own teachings. But that is not an option for Christianity. Christianity cannot easily say, yes, all these miracle claims are real, but they are all equally valid signs from different gods. It has to explain why miracle claims that support Christianity should count, while miracle claims that support other religions should not. Second, even if we grant that a modern-day Christophany really happened, it still would not prove that Jesus was physically raised from the dead 2,000 years ago. This is where the comparison with Marian apparitions is helpful. Catholics have reported Marian apparitions for generations, but even if we granted for the sake of argument that Mary really appeared to people, would that prove the doctrine of the Assumption of Mary? No, it would not follow. A person could say, maybe Mary died like anyone else, and what people are seeing is her spirit. Or a person could say, maybe God is allowing Mary to appear without her body being physically assumed into heaven. In other words, even if the apparition is real, the doctrine does not automatically follow from the apparition. And the same point applies to modern-day Christophanies. Even if someone really had an appearance of Jesus, that would not automatically prove that Jesus' corpse physically left the tomb in the 1st century. Maybe it was a vision. Maybe it was a spiritual appearance. Maybe God, if he exists, allowed an appearance of Jesus without requiring a physical resurrection. Maybe something else is going on. The point is not that I believe those alternatives. The point is that Than has not ruled them out. So when Than uses modern-day Christophanies to support Jesus' physical resurrection, he is skipping a step. At most, a modern-day Christophany, if it happened, could show that someone experienced an appearance of Jesus. It would not show that Jesus was bodily raised from the dead 2,000 years ago. That is why this argument does not work. It treats Jesus appeared as if it automatically means Jesus was physically resurrected. But those are not the same claim. And if Than would not accept Marian apparitions as evidence that Mary was bodily assumed into heaven, then he should not treat modern-day Christophanies as evidence that Jesus was bodily raised from the dead. Third, Than's description of this modern-day miracle healing is grossly exaggerated. He said there are brain scans to prove that Marlene Klepees was miraculously healed. But as far as I can tell, there are no brain scans showing that she used to have cerebral palsy and then afterwards no longer had it. There is not even a copy of a diagnosis paper signed by a physician confirming that Marlene Klepees had cerebral palsy in the first place. And this exaggeration on Than's part actually highlights the problem with the resurrection accounts in the Gospels. The Gospel writers were highly motivated to tell others that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. Than is also highly motivated to defend Jesus' resurrection. And here he is, in front of a camera, exaggerating what the evidence shows. So do we really think the Gospel writers would never exaggerate the resurrection accounts, even just a little bit? Than is doing this in front of a camera, in a modern world where people can pause the video, check the claim, and look for the evidence. So I don't see why the Gospel writers could not have done something similar in a world where verification was much harder and where they were far more likely to get away with it. And exaggeration does not even require the Gospel authors to consciously lie. It only requires someone along the way to make the story a little stronger before the material reached the Gospel authors. That is all it takes. That's all I will say about Marlene Klepees here. Matt Dillahunty made a video analyzing this modern-day miracle claim, so if you are interested in following up on that, I will leave a link in the description. And here is my fourth point in response to Than's inclusion of modern-day miracles in his calculation of Jesus' resurrection. The 21 distinct reports of Jesus' resurrection are only Than's first update of his prior probability. In his blog, Than then uses the accounts of the Apostle Paul and James, the brother of Jesus, as further evidence for Jesus' resurrection in a second round of updating. Than separates these two from the first update because Paul and James were supposedly skeptics. They were not already disciples of Jesus, so Than calls this piece of evidence the conversion of skeptics. But I think Than is exaggerating the evidential weight of Paul and James in the same way he exaggerated the Marlene Klepees story. First, let's talk about Paul. Is it fair to classify Paul as a skeptic? I think that is questionable. Paul was not an atheist. He was not an agnostic. He was not a modern skeptic who rejected miracles, angels, visions, demons, divine revelation, or resurrection. Paul was a deeply religious Jew. He was passionate about following the laws of Moses. In fact, one reason he persecuted Christians so passionately was precisely because of his religious commitment. Paul believed in the same God as Christians. They just had different theologies. Jesus' disciples believed Jesus was the Messiah. Paul did not. Paul persecuted Christians not because they believed in God, but because he thought they were heretics. And we have seen this kind of thing throughout religious history. The church often persecuted heretics. Does Than call those church authorities skeptics? I doubt it. They were not skeptics in a relevant sense. They were religious insiders defending one version of their religion against another version. That is much closer to what Paul was doing. So I would not say Paul represents a skeptical outsider being convinced by overwhelming evidence. I would say Paul represents one highly religious person moving from one theological camp to another after a spiritual experience. And that happens all the time. People move from one religious tradition to another because they report having dreams, visions, spiritual confirmations, answered prayers, or powerful emotional experiences. For example, some mainstream Christians join the Mormon Church because they say they experienced the confirmation of the Holy Spirit in their bosom. Suppose Latter-day Saint apologists use the same Bayesian reasoning and say this: if the Holy Spirit wants people to know that the LDS Church is true, we would expect people to have spiritual confirmation. But if the Holy Spirit disapproves of the LDS Church, we would not expect people to have these experiences. Therefore, these conversion experiences strongly raise the probability that the LDS Church is true. Would Than accept that? Probably not. But then he needs to be careful with Paul. A religious person switching from one religious interpretation to another after a spiritual experience is not some shocking, nearly impossible event. It is actually very common. And let's not forget that the main issue we are discussing here, the issue is not merely whether Paul had a religious experience. The issue is whether Jesus was bodily raised from the dead. This is often missed, but Paul's conversion experience is not a straightforward confirmation of Jesus' bodily resurrection. It is similar to the Marian apparition point I made earlier. Marian apparitions, even if they happen, would not automatically prove that Mary was bodily assumed into heaven. In the same way, a Christophany, even if it happened, would not automatically prove that Jesus was bodily raised from the dead. If you read the accounts of Paul's conversion in Acts, they look much more like modern-day Christophanies than like physical resurrection appearances. Paul's encounter with Jesus on the Damascus road took place several years after Jesus supposedly ascended to heaven, and Paul did not touch Jesus' body. He did not eat with Jesus. He did not inspect wounds. He did not see Jesus walking around in ordinary bodily form. In his debate with Matt Dillahunty, Sam presented a slide summarizing what the relevant passages in Acts tell us, and you can see it on the screen. If you read the slide closely, the description is not a bodily resurrection appearance. The appearance is described as a light from heaven. Paul and his companions fall to the ground. Then Paul hears a voice asking, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Paul asks, "Who are you, Lord?" And the voice replies, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." That is the experience described in Acts. There is no description of Jesus standing there in bodily form. There is no description of Jesus' face. There is no description of a body Paul could touch, examine, or identify. Paul hears a voice and has a conversation with this voice. And more importantly, the Damascus Road experience itself does not say anything about Jesus being physically raised from the dead. The voice does not say, "By the way, I was bodily raised from the dead." The voice says, "Why are you persecuting me?" and then tells Paul to get up and go to the city. Acts recounts this conversion experience 3 times. None of those passages describe Jesus being physically raised from the dead. Not in Acts 9, not in Acts 22, not in Acts 26. Now, I'm not saying Paul did not eventually believe Jesus rose from the dead. He did. Paul clearly came to believe that. He may even have immediately inferred from this experience that Jesus was raised from the dead, because that was what Christians were already preaching. But the description of the event itself does not establish that. If we simply read the account, a person could conclude that Paul had a vision of someone who had died, and that would still be compatible with the belief that a person's spirit leaves the body after death and communicates with the living. No physical resurrection is needed. So, Paul's conversion may show that Paul believed he encountered Jesus. It may show that Paul changed his theology. It may show that Paul came to accept the Christian claim that Jesus was raised, but it is not direct evidence that Jesus' corpse physically left the tomb. And that distinction matters. If we read Paul's first-hand account in 1 Corinthians 15, he does say that the reason Jesus appeared to him after appearing to the disciples. But when Paul describes his own experience, it is not clear that he is talking about a physical encounter like the ones we read in the Gospels. So Paul's own accounts could easily align with the accounts in Acts, where the experience is visionary. It is not multimodal. It is not multisensory. It is not Jesus eating a meal with Paul as he supposedly did with the disciples. It is not Paul touching Jesus' wounds. Paul says Jesus appeared to him, but that alone does not tell us what kind of appearance it was. This is exactly like the point I made earlier about Marian apparitions. Catholics may infer from Marian apparitions that the doctrine of the Assumption of Mary is true, but that is a theological connection believers make. The appearances themselves do not prove that Mary was bodily assumed into heaven. It is also like the Marlene Klepees account. Marlene reportedly dreamed of Jesus and later reported being healed. But what does that have to do with the physical resurrection of Jesus? There's no clear connection. At most, it would show that someone had an experience they interpreted as Jesus. It would not show that Jesus' corpse physically left the tomb 2,000 years ago. When it comes to James, the brother of Jesus, it is even worse. The New Testament does not actually tell us when James was converted. Many Christians assume that James was a skeptic until the risen Jesus appeared to him, but the text does not say that. Yes, 1 Corinthians 15 says that Jesus appeared to James, but it does not say that this appearance was the moment James converted from skepticism to Christianity. We cannot be sure that James was skeptical at the time. We do have passages such as John 7:5, which says Jesus' brothers did not believe in him, and Mark 3:21, where Jesus' family seems to think he is out of his mind. But James is not mentioned by name in those passages. Maybe some of Jesus' brothers did not believe in him, but James was an exception. We cannot rule that out. And even if we assume James was not a believer at some point during Jesus' ministry, we still cannot rule out the possibility that he later changed his mind and followed Jesus before Jesus died. The New Testament does not tell us exactly how or when James became a believer, yet Than feels comfortable assuming that James was a skeptic right before the reason Jesus appeared to him, and that this appearance forced him to change his mind. That assumption is doing a lot of work with very little text. So let's summarize what Than is doing here. Than knows that Paul's experience does not involve the kind of multimodal, multisensory evidence he emphasizes elsewhere. Paul does not touch Jesus. Paul does not eat with Jesus. Paul does not inspect Jesus' wound. In Acts, Paul sees a light and hears a voice. Than also knows that we do not even have a conversion account for James, the brother of Jesus. We are not told when James converted, how James converted, or whether the appearance in 1 Corinthians 15 was the reason he converted. And yet, Than feels justified inserting numbers into his Bayesian calculation that produce a likelihood ratio similar to the one associated with those 21 distinct testimony accounts, which supposedly involve multisensory experience such as touching Jesus and eating a meal with Jesus. He just treats Paul and James as another powerful update, as if there's nothing wrong with that. That is the level of intellectual rigor we are seeing here. This reminds me of William Lane Craig.
When I first heard the message of the gospel as a non-Christian high school student, that my sins could be forgiven by God, that God loved me, he loved Bill Craig, and that I could come to know him and experience eternal life with God, I thought to myself, and I'm not kidding, I thought, if there is just one chance in a million that this is true, it's worth believing. And so my attitude toward this is just the opposite of Kyle's. Far from raising the bar or the epistemic standard that Christianity must meet to be believed, I lower it.
I mean, what is the probability that a God exists and truly wants a relationship with you, but the evidence he chooses to provide is so underwhelming that you have to lower your intellectual standards just to find it persuasive? Just saying. Here's my fifth and last point on modern-day miracles. Christian apologists often forget to factor in the absence of miracles, and this artificially boosts the probability in their favor. That is classic confirmation bias. They look only at cases where something fascinating happened and then use those cases to boost the credibility of their religion. But they ignore all the cases where we would expect something to happen if their hypotheses were true and nothing happened. The availability heuristic is when we judge how common or likely something is based on how easily examples come to mind. Dramatic stories are easier to remember. They feel more important. They feel more evidential. So when we hear a story about Paul seeing Jesus or someone being healed after a dream about Jesus, those stories stand out in our minds. But the known events do not stand out. Nobody writes a testimony about the thousands of people who prayed and were not healed. Nobody preaches a sermon about all the people who sincerely sought God and never received a vision. Nobody makes a miracle video about the devout believer who asked Jesus to appear and heard nothing. So the miracle stories become psychologically available while the silence, failure, and the absence of miracles disappear from view. That can seriously distort our judgment. Take Paul's conversion, for example. Paul was persecuting Christians, so Christians say there was no psychological expectation for him to see Jesus. Yet he had a vision of Jesus. So that should at least count as a piece of evidence for Jesus' resurrection. If you focus only on Paul, it can feel like this should boost the likelihood of the resurrection hypothesis, but that feeling is unwarranted because of confirmation bias and availability heuristic. If we look at the thousands of other devout Jews during Paul's time, many of whom were genuinely seeking God and waiting for the Messiah, and yet never had a vision of Jesus, then Paul's vision becomes much less impressive. In other words, if Paul's vision counts for the resurrection hypothesis, then other devout Jews not having Jesus should also count against the resurrection hypothesis. Why? Because one of the reasons Christians give for why Jesus appeared mostly to his disciples and not to other Pharisees, priests, or Jewish leaders is that their hearts were hardened. But if they bring up Paul's conversion as evidence, then they can no longer use that argument so easily. Paul was not merely uninterested in the Jesus movement, he was actively persecuting Christians. You can hardly find someone more opposed to the Christian movement than Paul. And yet, Jesus supposedly appeared to him and forced him to convert. By the way, consideration of free will also seems to be conveniently forgotten here. But let's not get into that. So if Jesus was willing to appear to Paul, why did Jesus not appear to other devout Jews? Why not appear to other Pharisees? Why not appear to the priests? Why not appear publicly to those who were sincerely looking for the Messiah? Of course, this is where the Texas Sharpshooter fallacy comes in. Apologists can simply say, well, God intended to choose Paul and not the others, so this is completely expected. But that is exactly the problem. They drew the target around the bullet hole after the fact. Whatever happened becomes what God intended to happen. Whatever did not happen becomes what God intended not to happen. You can look at my previous video where I explained why this is a fallacy. And it is not just that. Suppose God exists, chose Israel, and became incarnate among them in a person of Jesus of Nazareth. Wouldn't we expect God to choose a method that would make this clear to his chosen people beyond reasonable doubt, so they could carry that message to the rest of the world? I mean, if you only read the Old Testament and the 4 Gospels, that seems like a reasonable expectation. And yet, according to the Christian story, when Jesus rose from the dead, he appeared mostly, if not only, to his own disciples. He did not appear publicly to other Jews. He did not appear to the chief priests. He did not appear to the Pharisees as a group. He did not present himself in a way that would make the Jewish people say, yes, this is clearly the Messiah we were waiting for. Instead, Jesus appeared to his followers, then ascended after a few weeks, and then, according to Acts, the disciples still largely stayed in Jerusalem, even though the mission was supposed to go to the nations. So Jesus had to appear to Paul later and send him to the Gentiles, while the Jewish people themselves largely remained unconvinced. And after 1 or 2 generations, Jewish Christianity became marginalized and eventually faded from the center of the movement. Is that what we would have expected? I wouldn't. But Christians can always defend this outcome by saying it was God's plan all along. The center of the Jesus movement shifted from Jews to Gentiles. That was God's plan. The Jewish people largely rejected Jesus. That was also part of God's plan. Jewish Christianity faded while Gentile Christianity became dominant. Still part of God's plan. What about the Jews? Well, God will bring them back in the future. But how is that not the Texas Sharpshooter fallacy? No matter what happens, the target gets redrawn around the result. If the Jews accepted Jesus, Christians would say, see, God fulfilled his promise to Israel. But when most Jews did not accept Jesus, Christians say, see, God planned to turn to the Gentiles. If Jesus appeared publicly to Israel, Christians would say, see, God gave his chosen people undeniable evidence. But when Jesus allegedly appeared only to a small group of followers, Christians say, see, God chose humble witnesses and required other people to believe their testimonies by faith. Whatever happens becomes the expected outcome after the fact. If you still don't get my point, let me use another example that happens all too often today. A hurricane or wildfire hits a town. Almost everything is destroyed, but one church building is still standing. And Christians say, "Hallelujah, God preserved this church." That is confirmation bias. They focus on what is left, but ignore the hundreds of houses that were burned down or washed away. Many of those houses belong to Christians. Some people may have lost their lives, and yet people are celebrating because God supposedly preserved a church building. Why would God be interested in preserving a building while ignoring the lives that were lost? Was God not interested in those people? Of course, this is where the Texas Sharpshooter fallacy comes in. Christians can come up with all sorts of explanations after the fact for why it happened that way. But a more reasonable explanation is much simpler. God did not do anything special. Some buildings survived, some buildings did not. That is how disasters work. And if you say, "But it was a church building," that is exactly where the availability heuristic comes in. There are severe disasters across the world every year. In many of those disasters, church buildings are destroyed, just like every other building. But those stories do not stand out. They do not get turned into viral testimonies. They do not get shared as evidence that God did nothing. The story people remember is the unusual one. A church building still standing in the middle of destroyed houses. That stands out. That is memorable. That feels like God is still active today. But the fact that one story is more memorable does not mean it is better evidence. It only means it is more available in your mind. In the same way, out of thousands of devout Jews, one person had a vision of the leader of a new religious movement and converted to it. That does not require supernatural intervention. It only requires one person to have a powerful religious experience. The problem is that apologists remember the hit and ignore the misses. They remember Paul, but ignore all the Jews who never saw Jesus. They remember the healing testimony, but ignore all the prayers that went unanswered. They remember the church building that survived, but ignore the Christian homes that burned down. That is how confirmation bias and the availability heuristic work together. The dramatic cases are easier to remember, so they feel more significant. But if we are doing serious probability reasoning, we cannot just count the hits. We also have to count the misses. And once we do that, the miracle claims become much less impressive. Of course, Christians have other explanations for those misses. I know Than has a few more, but I'm not going to address all of them here. The main problem is that these explanations often make God's activity indistinguishable from chance. If something unusual happens, it is evidence that God acted. If nothing happens, God had a mysterious reason. If the evidence is weak, God wants faith. If the evidence is absent, God is hidden for a purpose. But at that point, what could possibly count against the claim? These excuses turn God's existence and activity into something unverifiable. No matter what happens, the theory survives. And that is not how serious probability reasoning works. If the hits raise the probability, then the misses have to count too. In my next video, I will tackle more problems with Than's Bayesian apologetics. I will also show you that not too long ago, Than personally admitted that he was not aware of a very important principle in probability theory, and I will explain how that creates a major problem for his reasoning and his model. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe so you don't miss part 3 when it is released. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.